The story begins with a luxurious car winding its way along a picturesque mountain road. Inside, a young bride and her considerably older groom are on their way to their secluded home. The young woman, Elizabeth, radiates happiness, believing she has stolen the older man's heart, while he views himself as her protector. They arrive at a breathtaking house with sweeping views of the surrounding mountains, trees, and clear blue sky. Awaiting them are the housekeeper, Claire, and a young man introduced as Oliver. Elizabeth is immediately amazed by the house, its expansive glass windows framing the stunning scenery, and the warm, inviting ambiance within. At the entrance, she sees wonderful flowers, white orchids and lilies, and she realizes Oliver is blind. An evening dinner features a lavish table and well-trained servants, and a night of love follows. In the morning, her husband shows his young wife around the house, displaying its expensive decor, paintings, and precious art pieces. He reveals a luxurious wardrobe brimming with designer clothes for her, a wonderful kitchen, and rooms more beautiful than the last. All the doors have biometric locks. In one corridor, Elizabeth sees a frosted glass door and asks Henry what lies beyond. He forbids her from entering, but Elizabeth points out the ubiquitous locks. Henry explains that the biometric scanners throughout the house are configured to recognize only two individuals, himself and Elizabeth. The next morning, Henry leaves. Elizabeth is sad, as it is their honeymoon. She occupies herself by swimming in the pool and wandering through the house. Elizabeth questions Claire about her tenure at the house, and feeling self-conscious, asks why a renowned scholar like Henry would choose to marry someone as unremarkable as herself. Claire, however, remains silent. Elizabeth fills her day reading, experimenting with different outfits and jewelry, and dancing in front of the mirror. As evening approaches, she observes Claire and Oliver leaving the house. Unable to sleep, Elizabeth wanders the house at night and unknowingly finds herself at the forbidden door. Overcome by curiosity, she enters. Inside, she discovers a laboratory-like room filled with equipment. She presses a button on a panel, which opens a hidden door revealing a glass capsule containing a young woman with a tube in her mouth, seemingly asleep. Terrified, Elizabeth flees, knocking over a table and cutting her finger in her panic. Henry returns the next morning. He plays the piano for Elizabeth, but quickly notices her distracted thoughts. He sees her bandaged finger and asks what happened. Elizabeth excuses herself, claiming she is clumsy. Henry's calm comment on Elizabeth's frighteningly good lying skills hurt her. Later, she pretended to sleep, then secretly followed Henry to the forbidden room, where he suddenly appeared, catching her in the act. Confronting Elizabeth for her disobedience, the girl tries to defend herself, claiming she saw nothing forbidden, but Henry explains that the fact of her disobedience is what matters. Terrified, she tried to escape but found herself trapped in the locked room. Henry pursued her relentlessly, catching her on the stairs and brutally attacking her with a metal poker. Later, Henry, Claire, and Oliver buried Elizabeth's body. Despite Claire's hope that it was over, Henry insisted it wasn't. 6 weeks later, a woman identical to Elizabeth appeared, repeating the same conversations and actions. Once again, Henry warned her against entering the forbidden room. Elizabeth promises to comply. They love each other again, while Claire watches them from the shadows. At night, Elizabeth cannot sleep. She walks around the house and finds Claire sitting in the kitchen. A curious conversation ensued, with Elizabeth's questions prompting further discussion. As Claire attempted to warn Elizabeth about something, Henry intervened, leading his wife back to their bedroom. In the morning, Henry leaves, asking Elizabeth to be a good girl. She wanders through the house, calling for Claire or Oliver, but no one responds. Bored, she again tries on clothes and jewelry, swims in the pool at night, and plays the piano in the living room. Drawn to the forbidden room, Elizabeth entered, only to flee screaming. That night she has a nightmare where the girl from the glass capsule, looking just like her, emerges from her sarcophagus and comes to her room. Meanwhile, Henry arrives, noticing that his wife is frightened. Elizabeth retreats to the bathroom, but Henry realizes she has disobeyed him. He bursts in, grabs her, and begins to choke her, but she kicks him in the face and escapes. Henry chases her throughout the house. In the kitchen, Elizabeth arms herself with knives, while Henry grabs a tampon soaked in ether. He sits at the piano and begins to play. Elizabeth relaxes, hearing the music, but it is a trap. A record plays, while Henry stealthily approaches her hiding spot. He grabs Elizabeth and presses the tampon to her face. It seems the game is lost, but in a final move, Elizabeth stabs him with a knife. Waking up in a pool of blood beside Henry's dead body, Elizabeth cleaned the kitchen, wrapped his body, and took it away in the elevator. She then cleaned herself, discarding her ring and burning her bloody clothes. Calling emergency services, She realized she didn't know the address. Just then, she encountered a stunned Claire and Oliver, feigning normalcy despite their shock at seeing her alive and unharmed. Elizabeth claims Henry is resting upstairs. Claire heads to the kitchen, suddenly collapsing from a heart attack. She reaches for the phone and calls for help. The ambulance takes Claire away. Elizabeth tries to leave, but Oliver says he cannot protect her if she goes out the door. He understands that Henry is dead. Frightened, Elizabeth tries to explain that it was self-defense. Oliver reassures her that he hated Henry too, and will help her get rid of the body. The young man asks what she remembers from her childhood. She responds that she was in the hospital for a long time after her parents died in a car accident and grew up in an orphanage. Oliver shows her a nearby house, saying that's where they lived together. Claire knows better because she worked with her. When Elizabeth questioned Oliver, he revealed the shocking truth. She was one of 6 clones of Henry's wife. Overwhelmed with panic, she desperately longed to return to the perceived normalcy of her honeymoon. Oliver advises Elizabeth to get as far away as possible. She can take money from the safe. The girl goes to her room to pack her things. Oliver enters with Claire's diary in his hands. He asks her to read it. While she tries to decipher the handwriting, Oliver locks the doors. Elizabeth doesn't understand what's happening. She asks to be let out, but Oliver is unyielding. In despair, Elizabeth begins to read Claire's diary. She learns that Claire received an invitation from Henry to work with him because she was a prominent geneticist. But when she learned what she would be doing, she became frightened as she found herself in the midst of a tragic love story. Henry revealed that his wife died shortly after giving birth to Oliver from a very rare disease. Her genes had suddenly and severely degenerated. Devastated by his wife's death from a mysterious disease, Henry cloned her, creating 6 copies, but the disease afflicted them as well. To halt its progression, he placed them in cryogenic stasis. By the time Claire joined, only 4 clones remained. She worked to decode the disease's genetic basis, while Henry tried to shape the clones' memories with recorded messages and music. However, the latest Elizabeth remembered nothing beyond a few seconds, suffering because she lacked a real inner world. The constant tension in her consciousness became too complex for her body to handle. One day, she entered the lab and fled in horror. The police found her and brought her to Henry's house, where Claire recognized her as her ailing niece. The strange accusations from the girl were dismissed as a mental disorder. Oliver interrupted Elizabeth's reading, bringing dinner and urging her to behave, but she attacked him, demanding the door code. He relented, and she went to the lab, where she found him working on the body of the latest, 6th Elizabeth clone. He asked her to hold the clone's head, and while she did, Oliver sedated her. Delirious, Elizabeth saw flashes of her predecessor's memories. She awoke chained to a bed, unable to escape, and remembers reading Claire's diary. It recounted their continued research and the subsequent death of another clone a week later, revealing the devastating relapse of neurodegeneration and Claire's despair. Henry despaired over his failed attempts, believing he'd wasted years behaving like a madman, but Claire argued he'd acted like a lover. A romantic relationship blossomed between them. Oliver interrupted, curious about what Claire had written about him. Elizabeth explains that Claire began an affair with Henry after the death of the 3rd subject. The woman didn't know that Henry had altered the samples. This meant Claire had no fault. She had managed to stop the disease, and the remaining clones were healthy. Oliver shares that in childhood, he admired Elizabeth because she was the most beautiful being he had ever seen. Yes, he could see back then. The children became friends, which displeased Henry. One day, Oliver saw Henry kiss the girl. That night, the man blinded Oliver. Having recounted everything, Oliver leaves and Elizabeth continues reading. Claire wrote that she ended the affair herself. Competing with Elizabeth was impossible. Furthermore, Henry spoke about his pain after losing his beloved. Now he dreams of reliving that first wedding night. Claire did not find any records of Elizabeth giving birth and realized that Oliver was not Henry's son. He was Henry himself. He created him because he feared Elizabeth would not want his current self. In the morning, Elizabeth wakes up to the feel of scissors. Oliver demands she tell him what Claire wrote about him in the diary. Elizabeth admits that Claire considered him a clone of Henry, but that is not true. Henry showed a birth certificate, so Oliver is not Henry. Elizabeth asks if he loves her and invites him to touch her. She removes her pants and beckons him closer. Oliver cannot resist temptation and approaches. He embraces Elizabeth, but the girl throws him to the floor and chokes him with the chain. She has to give him the keys to the shackles and reveal the real code to the door. Just then, another Elizabeth enters the room aiming a gun. The girls stare at each other. They are identical. Oliver tries to convince the new Elizabeth that the one in the room is sick, that she is an imposter and their enemy. The fifth Elizabeth argues that this is not true. They are hostages and she just wants to leave. Obeying Oliver, the sixth Elizabeth orders the other to lie on the floor, but the fifth Elizabeth shields Oliver. When the sixth finally fires, the bullet kills Oliver and wounds the fifth clone. She tries to escape, while the sixth clone weeps over Oliver. The injured Elizabeth exits the house. In her mind, all the visions and images that passed before her clones merge together. A gunshot rings out. The last Elizabeth kills her double. The final breath and last vision, herself, leaning close to her face. Morning comes. The last clone reads Claire's diary. Henry transfers all his possessions to Claire. Now she can continue her research. The man states that he never intended to kill the one he had wanted to resurrect all his life. It just happened. She died and now she brings him joy by dying again and again, and no one needs to know about it. These versions are not his Elizabeth. Only by destroying them does he feel that they are real, and Henry will do everything to put an end to this. Elizabeth finishes reading. She sees a taxi pull up to the house, from which Claire exits. They meet at the door. Elizabeth leaves everything to Claire, for she deserves it. Elizabeth walks down the road, leaving behind all that is terrifying and incomprehensible. All her life she dreamed of a wonderful man. She stole his heart, and he stole her from all misfortunes into his secret world. This film raises complex ethical questions. Do you think in the future we will have the possibility to clone our loved ones? And would you do that? Anyway, thank you for watching. I would appreciate if you would subscribe to my channel.